All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the book of Leviticus. In this recording, we are going to look at Leviticus chapters 18 through 20. It's a big chunk, but in a lot of ways it all goes together. In fact, oftentimes you'll hear this section referred to as the Holiness Code. And so, as always, let's begin with some context. If you recall chapter 17, the major topic of that chapter was the issue of blood, bringing sacrifices to the tabernacle now that the tabernacle is open for business. And the reason for that is because blood is sacred, and therefore you can't eat blood. You have to drain the blood. And then he even deals at the end of that chapter with the proper handling of meat and butchering of animals. And that chapter, in a lot of ways, provides sort of the transition from the first half of the book to the second half of the book. In the first half of the book of Leviticus, Leviticus 1 through 16, or even chapter 17, exclusively focused on matters pertaining to worship and ritual purity, sacrifices, ordination of the priest, opening ceremonies of the tabernacle, ritual purity regarding diet and other stuff of everyday life, the Day of Atonement, right? All of that stuff focuses on worship and ritual purity. In chapter 17, as we noted, was even about that, at least at the beginning, where it was about bringing your sacrifices to the tabernacle and blood's purpose for atonement. But chapter 17 ended by shifting to a matter of everyday life, the proper butchering of animals because of the sacred nature of blood. Well, now here in chapters 18 through 20, we shift to dealing with just matters of everyday life. As I noted, it's been called the Holiness Code. And the reason for that is because it is about matters pertaining to holy living as God's people. And if you keep in mind the overall really broad context of the book of Leviticus in relationship to the book of Exodus, you recall that Exodus 19:6 points out that Israel's vocation, their calling, is to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And the word holy means distinct or different. It means set apart for God's purposes. So as you read through Leviticus 18 through 20, the question to have in mind is, what are some ways Israel is supposed to be holy, different, distinct from the nations around them as a reflection of God's own holiness? Also, before we begin, it's worth noting that the Apostle Peter, in his first letter, echoes this very question and this very theme by quoting from this section of Leviticus when he says in 1 Peter chapter 1, "Be holy as I am holy, says the Lord." And then Peter calls us to be holy in all our behavior. Well, chapters 18 through 20 of Leviticus show us some of the ways that Israel was to be holy in all their behavior. And that begins right from the outset here in chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, where God says, "You must not be like them, but be different, because I am your God." Listen to these words from Leviticus 18, 1 through 5. "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Speak to the sons of Israel, and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do what is done in the land of Egypt where you lived, nor are you to do what is done in the land of Canaan where I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You are to perform my judgments and keep my statutes and to live in accordance with them. I am the Lord your God. So you shall keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a person follows them, then he will live by them. I am the Lord." Notice in these 5 verses how all of this is connected to God and their covenant relationship with him. It's stated 2 times, "I am the Lord your God." And the word Lord there is Yahweh. I am Yahweh your God. And then it ends with, "I am Yahweh," right at the end. They don't do this to become God's people. They already are God's people. It's the same as it is for us in Christ today. We don't obey to become part of Christ's family. We enter into Christ's family, and then we learn how to obey. Well, that was the same for them. This is how they're going to honor God as their God, and it's highly relational. Since he's their God, they have responsibilities to live in a certain kind of way. And notice how verse 5 says that the person who follows them will live by them. That is, doing what the Lord has said is the path of life. If they do them, they will experience the fullness of life in and through them. This passage is actually, verse 5 here, is quoted several times in the New Testament to make the point that Israel actually failed to do that. They failed to live by the covenant instructions. That's why they didn't experience the blessing of life, but rather they suffered the curses of the covenant and were enduring those right down to the first century. So they need to live differently from where they came from, Egypt, and where they are going, Canaan, and to do so as a way of honoring their God who rescued them and entered into a covenant relationship with them. Then the rest of chapter 18 gives instructions about what that should look like, specifically in the realm of sexual behavior. That's the focus of chapter 18. So verse 6 says, "None of you shall approach any blood relative to uncover his nakedness. I am the Lord." Again, notice it's tied to their relationship with God. I am the Lord. Because of that, you can't have sex with any blood relative. And then in the ensuing verses 7 through 17, it lists off just a handful of specific examples of the kind of blood relatives it has in mind. Your father, your mother, your father's wife, your sister, your son's daughter, your daughter's daughter, your father's sister, right? And it just lists off all these things and says no sexual activity with them. And what we need to keep in mind in this is that extended families lived together in the ancient Near East. So these prohibitions, one of the things they do is they serve to protect the women in the household from the men in the household. These women are off limits. Sex with them is wrong. The chapter goes on in verse 18 and says, "You shall not marry a woman in addition to her sister as a second wife while she is alive, so as to uncover her nakedness." Now, there is actually some debate about whether the word sister here is literal or not. And the reason there's debate is because this exact phrase is used a handful of times in the Old Testament, and it doesn't mean a literal sister, it means another Israelite. In fact, even the male version is used a few times in the Old Testament, and it doesn't refer to a literal brother, it refers to a fellow Israelite. So there's debate about, is that what's being said here? Are we talking about not just a literal sister, but your fellow Israelite sister, right? If that's the case, if that's the way it should be understood here, then these instructions are prohibiting not just marrying two sisters, but having two wives, that would be wrong. Verse 19 goes on and says, "And you shall also not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness during her menstrual impurity. And you shall not have sexual intercourse with your neighbor's wife to be defiled with her." Notice that phrase, defiled with her. Just like ritual impurity made you unclean and defiled you, well, adultery defiles you as well. There is moral impurity. Verse 21 of chapter 18 sort of stands out because it's the one command that's not explicitly about sexual behavior. It says this, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Moloch, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." This refers to child sacrifice to the god Moloch that was practiced in various parts of Canaan in the ancient Near East. Obviously, Israel's not to do that. They honor the Lord. They don't practice this sort of abomination. Then he goes on in verse 22 and says, "You shall not sleep with a male as one sleeps with a female. It's an abomination." So homosexual sex is forbidden. It is wrong. Not only that, bestiality is wrong. Look at verse 23. "And you shall not have sexual intercourse with an animal to be defiled with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it." It's a perversion. It crosses the boundaries of the way things are supposed to be. So what chapter 18 is telling us is that in their sexual life, the Israelites are to do what the Lord commands and follow his ways, not the ways of the culture around them. How serious is this? Well, the rest of the chapter describes the consequences of doing these types of things and points out the seriousness of it. So look at verse 24. "Do not defile yourself by any of these things. Make yourselves morally impure, for by all these things the nations which I'm driving out from you have become defiled. For the land has become defiled, therefore I have brought its punishment upon it, so that the land has vomited out the inhabitants. And so as Israel moves in, they're supposed to drive out the people, and these sorts of practices are one of the key reasons for it. The land itself, he says, is now defiled. It's unclean and dirty, and I'm bringing you into it to both punish the land and give it a respite from this sort of filthiness. Verse 26 goes on and says, "But as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and you shall not do any of these abominations, neither the native," that is, the Israelite, "nor the stranger who resides among you," the non-Jew who lives among you. They're not supposed to do this either. "For the people of the land who were there before you did all these abominations, and the land has become defiled, so that the land will not vomit you out, just as it vomited out the nations that were there before you." So they need to abide by this, or God will do the same thing to them that he's doing to the people of Canaan who live there now. "For whoever does any of these abominations, those persons who do so shall be cut off from their people. So you are to keep your commitment to me." Notice again how relational it is. Don't do this, you will be cut off from the people. Don't do this, you'll be kicked out of the land. Why? Because you're to keep your commitment to me. Your sexual holiness reflects your commitment to Yahweh. And therefore, you cannot practice the abominable customs which are practiced before you in the land. Now, before we leave chapter 18 and move to chapter 19, let me just offer a brief reflection here, and it is simply this, that sexual holiness is serious between God and his people. It's clearly a priority in Israel's relationship with God, and the same is true for us as well. God has very clear and definite design for sexual behavior, and if we want to experience genuine life, fullness of life, then we must follow God's ways. If we want to honor God, we must follow his ways, which means no adultery, no polygamy, no homosexual sex, no sex with animals. Verse 26 says, "These are for the Israelite and the foreigner living among them," the stranger living among them. That's why even Acts 15 references back to this and says that in the Messiah we must avoid sexual morality. And the Apostle Paul says that this is God's will for you, your sanctification, specifically that you abstain from sexual immorality. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 3 through 5. So the Lord's people must embrace and embody God's vision for sexual behavior. And that vision protects the vulnerable and builds up marriage and family. So that's chapter 18. Chapter 19 continues this theme of holiness in the realm of everyday life by dealing with just a wide range of instructions that are incredibly down to earth. As you read it, look for that. It deals with things like honoring father and mother, how you reap your fields, stealing or lying or defrauding your fellow Israelite in any way, how and when you're to pay your workers, not using your daughter as a prostitute to make ends meet, accurate weights and measures. These are just stuff of ordinary life. And then thrown into the midst of that are a few more explicitly religious things like keeping the Sabbath, fellowship offerings, not going to a medium or a soothsayer or a spiritist because God alone is your God. All of this is framed in chapter 19 as being holy because God is holy, which reminds us that holiness deals with the stuff of everyday life. A couple other things about this chapter, chapter 19. It's also here in chapter 19, and in this very context of everyday holiness, where Jesus quotes from when he says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." That comes out of Leviticus 19. And then a number of the instructions here derive directly from the Ten Commandments, which are, again, foundational commands for Israel's holiness, and they're here applied to specific circumstances of life. One other thing in this chapter is that one of the punishment that shows up here and in chapter 20 is being cut off from the assembly. That is, banished from the community of people. And we may not feel the weight of that, but the Africa Bible Commentary points out how powerful this is as a motivational appeal for your behavior and how you live in communal cultures. In communal cultures, the community is everything. In fact, in the Africa Bible Commentary, they say one of their little proverbs or maxims for life is that where there is no community, there is no life. And thus that punishment, that consequence provides great motivational appeal for behaving in a way that is in keeping with community standards and community life. So let's just walk down through chapter 19 and point out at least highlight a few of the details of some of the instructions here. Chapter 19, verse 1 says, "Then the Lord God spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the sons of Israel and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And then it gives a couple commands that derive directly from the Ten Commandments. "Every one of you shall revere his mother and father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God." So that's Commandments 5 and Commandment 4, right? I am the Lord your God. You're going to do this because that's what I instructed you. "Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves cast metal gods. I am the Lord your God." This refers to commandments Numbers 1 and 2. And this reminds us that these instructions are tied specifically to their covenant loyalty to Yahweh himself. They have entered into a covenant relationship with him. He is the Lord their God. They need to honor him and honor him alone. Additionally, some of the instructions in chapter 19 are about what could be called horizontal holiness. Commands about their loyalty to Yahweh is like vertical holiness. Horizontal holiness is about our relationship with other people. And a number of these commands are about that kind of thing. So jump down to 19:9. "Now, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God." And so as part of their covenant faithfulness to God, they don't reap all the way to the edges of their field. They don't gather up all the things that have fallen on the ground when they harvest their vineyard and their grapes. Why? Because there's needy people in the land, and God is making a provision here that those who have land leave some of the produce of the land for the poor people to come and gather up themselves. This is to be a practical way of caring for and providing for the less fortunate when they enter into the promised land. Verse 13 says, "You shall not oppress your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of a hired worker are not to remain with you all night until morning." The idea of oppress here is to defraud. And so we're talking about defrauding your fellow Israelite, your neighbor, by robbing him of his wages, not paying him. The idea is withholding pay. It pictures a day laborer who you're supposed to pay at the end of the day so that he can actually buy food for his family that night. And this pertains to prohibiting unjust behavior from the powerful against the weak and the common person. Verse 14 says, "You shall not curse a person who is deaf, nor put a stumbling block before a person who is blind, but you shall revere your God. I am the Lord." Again, notice, protection against harming a vulnerable or disadvantaged person. Fearing God entails not using your power for selfish ends and harming others. That's the principle underlying verse 14. Jump down to verses 17 and 18. That's where we get the love your neighbor as yourself command that Jesus quotes. And you can see the original context here. Verse 17 says, "You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may certainly rebuke your neighbor, but you are not to incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor hold any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord your God." And so you can see in its original immediate context, the first application of loving your neighbor as yourself is a commitment to doing good to those, even those who have wronged you or harmed you, no vengeance against them. Verse 19 deals with an interesting command that is really a little unclear. It says, "You are to keep my statutes. You shall not crossbreed two kinds of your cattle. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor wear a garment made of two kinds of material mixed together." And the fact is, the situational context or cultural condition that makes sense of this is just lost to us. We don't know for sure why these commands were given. Now, interestingly, Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 9 through 11, repeats these kinds of commands, repeats two of them, actually adds another one to it. And when it talks about the sowing of two types of seed together, it says this: "If you do that, all the produce of the seed which you have sown and the yield of the vineyard will be forfeited to the sanctuary." And that condition makes me wonder if there's some sort of ritual reason for these commands. Like in the ancient Near East, was this kind of intermixing of materials and animals connected to ritual behavior, and that's why you're not supposed to do it. But again, we just don't really know. It's not super clear, but for them, this was something they weren't supposed to do. Look at verses 20 through 22. Those verses can actually be challenging for us because it deals with a very foreign situation to most of us. It says this: "Now, if a man has sexual relations with a woman who is a servant, an ebed, acquired for another man, but who has in no way become redeemed nor given her freedom, there shall be punishment. They shall not, however, be put to death because she wasn't free. He shall bring his guilt offering to the Lord, to the doorway of the tent of meeting, a ram as a guilt offering. The priest shall also make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before the Lord, for his sin which he has committed, and the sin which has been committed will be forgiven him." So notice this acknowledges that there is a sin that's been committed, and that there needs to be a guilt offering with restitution and forgiveness prescribed. Now, what's the situation behind this? Again, it's very foreign to us, but the situation appears to be a servant girl who has actually been arranged to marry someone else, but not yet officially betrothed or married. And she and another man have sex. The language here implies that it was consensual, because if it was rape, then there would have been the danger of the death penalty. So this seems to be a consensual act between this woman and another man. And so because she's not officially betrothed or married, there is no adultery, and therefore there is no death penalty. That seems to be what's going on here. And therefore, there still needs to be compensation. That's the idea of punishment, and a bride price. There needs to be some sort of repayment made because she was originally pledged to marry somebody else. And then now she's had sexual relationships with this man, and he is now responsible for that. So he has to make compensation to the man who was going to marry her. So restitution needs to be made, and a guilt offering needs to be brought. Let me also highlight verses 26 through 28, because this group of commands pertains to pagan practices. It says this: "You shall not eat any meat in it with blood." We've already talked about that in chapter 17. "You shall not practice divination, nor soothsaying. You shall not round off the hairline of your heads, nor trim the edges of your beard. You shall not make any cuts in your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourself. I am the Lord." All of this has to do with various pagan practices. In fact, the idea of rounding the hairline of your heads, trimming the edge of your beard, making cuts on your body for the dead, these all seem to be pagan mourning rituals. In fact, Deuteronomy mentions two of them again and connects them with being set apart from the nations. These are the things the nations did as part of their rituals. You're going to be distinct and different because you're holy. I am the Lord. Now, one last one I want to highlight is right at the end of the chapter in verse 35 and following, and it says this: "You shall do no wrong in judgment, in measurement of weight or volume. You shall have accurate balances, accurate weights, an accurate ephah, and an accurate hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So you shall keep all my statutes and my ordinances and do them. I am the Lord." Again, this shows us how down-to-earth God's instructions are. As a society, you need to have accurate weights and measures. That's what's being said here. And it shows us how down to earth and practical holiness is. So chapter 19 is all about practical holiness in the stuff of everyday life. Chapter 20 continues the conversation of being holy because God is holy, and it has a lot of overlap with chapter 18, but the way it's stated is different, and there's a reason for that. Chapter 18 stated things as, "You shall not." Chapter 20 states things as case law. If this happens, then here's what you do. That's the difference. So chapter 18 says, don't do this. Chapter 20 tells us what you need to do if someone does this. So chapter 20 emphasizes the penalties for the actions that were described in chapter 18. And some of the penalties are very severe: death, or being cut off from the people. In fact, the first 13 verses deal with cases where the penalty is one of those two. In fact, most often, it's death. Child sacrifice to Moloch, death. Uttering a curse against mother or father, death. Illicit sexual behavior, adultery, sexual relations with close family members, homosexual sex, sex with animals, death. God intends to protect the sanctity of marriage, family, and sex. And oftentimes, the perpetrators are said to have brought their death upon themselves. In the case of using mediums or soothsayers or Moloch worship and any other idolatry, it's described as playing the prostitute because they are violating their covenant relationship with Yahweh. They are committing spiritual adultery, and that theme will show up throughout the Old Testament and in the prophets later as they recall this sort of language and remind Israel, you're playing the prostitute by being unfaithful to your covenant relationship with Yahweh. And then the whole section of chapter 20 ends with this warning. Verse 22 says, "You are therefore to keep all my statutes and all my ordinances and do them, so that the land to which I'm bringing you to live in will not vomit you out." That's the ultimate threat. That's the ultimate curse of the covenant. You violate the commands, you are unfaithful to your covenant, then the same thing's going to happen to you that you will do to the nations currently living in Canaan. That the land is going to vomit them out through your invasion, and it will happen to you if you're not faithful to God as well. Furthermore, you shall not follow the customs of the nation which I'm going to drive out before you, because they did all these things. Therefore, I felt disgust for them. So I have said to you, you are to take possession of their land, and I myself will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has singled you out from the peoples. And then what God says is something that gives us real insight into the purpose of some of the clean and unclean laws, particularly the food laws. He says this in verse 25, "You are therefore, because God is your God, you are therefore to make a distinction between the clean animal and the unclean, between the unclean bird and the clean. And you shall not make yourselves detestable by animal or by bird or by anything that crawls on the ground, which I have distinguished for you as unclean. So you are to be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have singled you out from the peoples to be mine." Notice that about the clean and unclean animals, how it's directly connected to their holiness in the sense that they are distinct and different from the nations. Here's one of the ways I have distinguished you from the nations, by that which you eat. And that's why we had all of the clean and unclean instructions about food in Leviticus chapter 11. Now, as we wrap up this section here in chapters 18 through 20, just a little bit more by way of theological reflection, and that's very simply this. God takes holiness very seriously. He takes the holiness of his people with the utmost seriousness, and that means we, as his people, need to do the same. This also reminds us, as we've noted going through it, that holiness is practical. It deals with the stuff of everyday life. Holiness isn't just religious activities, saying your prayers before you eat, going to church on Sunday, and being actively religious. That's all nice and good and important, but holiness goes beyond that to shape our everyday life. And because of it, it has the power to shape a whole society. And that's what we see here for Israel. These instructions are going to shape their society. It's going to shape their community life so that they, as an entire people, will be distinct and different, a holy nation among the nations around them. And all of this points us towards Jesus in this way, that Jesus himself embodied this very kind of practical holiness. In fact, Jesus himself taught this very kind of practical holiness. You can see that, for example, in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Very down-to-earth, practical holiness as well. And Jesus himself died to make us holy, that we are now set apart to be his holy people. Not just religious per se, but embodying this very practical, everyday kind of holiness. And so 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 14 through 19 says this, "As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in ignorance, but like the Holy One who has called you, be holy yourselves in all your behavior, in all your way of life." Why? Because it is written, "You shall be holy, for I am holy," quoting here from Leviticus 19. "And if you address as Father, the one who impartially judges each person according to his work, then conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your sojourn, knowing that you were not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your feudal way of life inherited from your forefathers, but you were redeemed with precious blood, as of a lamb, unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ." The redemption that we have in Christ by his blood leads us to live distinct holy lives. That was the pattern for Israel. They were redeemed from Egypt and then entered into covenant and then were called to live a certain kind of way. We have been redeemed from sin through the blood of Jesus, enter into relationship with God, and now are called to live a holy life that honors our Holy Father. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the Old Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that only exists because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, you can do so by going to listenerscommentary.com, clicking the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page, my page at World Family Mission, where you can put in a dollar amount. If you want to make it a recurring monthly donation, there's a little box that says, "Make this monthly." All those funds will come this way to help more and more people learn and live the Bible. Thanks a ton for your support.